First of all, I should thank the organizers for holding up this Lit Fest, and I'm so grateful that I'm sitting with Aishwarya Pandit ji and Sudesh ji, two people I've followed for such a long time, and also for one reason, why I really loved uh, being here and moderating this session, because I always believe that we are actually amidst history being made. This is the period, this is a time when lots of things are happening which we are actually not able to comprehend in the sense which we should. But actually, I remember I was in one of the universities in one of the colleges in Delhi University, and I was asked, I told those kids that 100 years from now, when we look back at the period from 2014 to 2024 and after, we'll realize that we were part of the history being made at that time. No one would have thought that Ram Mandir will be inaugurated, or Article 370 will be scrapped. These all were when we were growing up. We thought that these things will not happen, and it happened in front of our eyes. So this Modi decade, about which Aishwarya Pandit ji has written a book, Indian Renaissance, is a very important episode in the nation's journey, in our life also. And that's why we need to evaluate that period. We need to look at that period. And unfortunately, I believe, because I've also written a book called Bharat Rising, which also kind of look back at this decade, this one decade of Modi decade. I genuinely believe that we have not yet comprehensively look back at the period with the kind of detailed eye which it needs. So I'm happy that I'm here. I'm here today with two gentlemen, with Aishwarya Pandit ji and Sudesh ji, to decode the Modi decade. First, I'll start with you, Aishwarya ji. Since as this Lit Fest goes, we are also amidst kind of tension between India and Pakistan right now, after what happened in Pahalgaon on April 22nd. So I'll start from there, because that is the question in everyone's mind, that what is Prime Minister Modi going to do now? So as somebody who has closely studied him, what is your opinion about that? Where is India-Pakistan relation going, and how is Prime Minister Modi going to take this forward?
I think, thank you, Utpal, for that introduction and also for the question. I think one thing has to be realized, that what Prime Minister Modi is going to do has to be seen in the context of India-Pakistan relations, and there is a history of India-Pakistan relations. That it's a very tensed and checkered history, because we've had a couple of wars, we've had partition, we've had migration and resettlement and refugees and other things, and then we've had the India-Bangladesh, India and Eastern Pakistan war, which ended up in creation of Bangladesh in 1971. Whenever India has gone to war, and then we've had Kargil and other things, but whenever we've gone to the war, I think the point is not about what the leaders at that time were doing, or that Indian prime ministers largely have not gone on the war path out of any willingness. We've always had a tendency to have friendly relations with Pakistan. It happens to be our immediate neighbor. It's that kind of a thing. You can't keep shifting houses, or you can't keep moving houses. But Prime Minister Modi is, contrary to what people might think, is evaluating the response in light of historical precedents, and in light of what has been the nature of India-Pakistan relationship, and how to respond and how to react to such situations. Everyone, if you go on social media, people will be like, we want revenge, we want this, we want that. But our Prime Minister is not necessarily a reckless Prime Minister. He's a Prime Minister who's known to take very informed decisions, or what I've understood of his decision making, and evaluating all aspects. And what speakers before me also said, that those responses have to be evaluated. There's a lot of expectation and pressure, so you have to see how Narendra Modi reacts to that pressure. And as far as I see, he's not reacting to that pressure of we need to do something. The idea is we need to do something to fix things, but that doesn't necessarily have to be now, today, yesterday, or right after the attack. It could be at a time and depending on the response to the situation. That's how it has always been. Even when Atal Bihari Vajpayee and Kargil happened, when he was Prime Minister, it was in response to infiltration by Pakistan, and there were necessary evidence. So India has never, or Indian Prime Ministers have never been aggressive as far as Pakistan is concerned. Majority of the statements you have always seen have come from the other side. Has to do with the tensions within Pakistan, the fault lines of Pakistan. Even though Jinnah believed it was a moth-eaten Pakistan, it inherited a lot of problems. It was not homogeneous. It has hugely diverse countries with a lot of push and pull factors. We tend to overrate how Pakistan as a country has to be seen. It has its own internal problems and dynamics, and there is no one-stop short solution. So I don't want to sound jingoistic and say we should do this and we should do that. But I want to say whatever his decision will be will be based on historicity of the relationship that existed between the two countries and evaluation of what comes before him.
Coming back to Swadeshi, see, this India-Pakistan relations, when we see, especially in the Modi's context, the main people's expectation is largely because, Uri and Balakot happened. So people are always looking from that perspective, what now? As somebody, who are one of the first biographers of Modi, how will you see that now he's going to come up with, find an answer to that expectation? The expectation is huge. Now everyone wants to find, okay, what now after Balakot?
You see, it's a question very difficult to answer. As Aishwarya said, that something is going to happen, as declared by Prime Minister Modi. And we must know that enough is enough, because the civilizational march about which Aishwarya's book talks about, I'll come to that civilizational march will not happen unless a rogue state like Pakistan exists in your neighbor. So Pakistan must be made to pay for its sin. Whether we are capable or not, you have seen the analysis on various television channels. We are far ahead. We can do that. We can retaliate. What way to do so that it's time to destroy Pakistan? Because, the way it has been trying to stop our civilizational march, and remember the 1,000 cut story, and they will go to an extent to bleed India, and they have been bleeding India. And a lot of wrongs were committed by our leaders, including one, giving independence to when Bangladesh was given to Pakistan. Then why should Bangladesh be a part of Pakistan when it is very much encircled by Indian territory? It's surprising, It was one of the biggest mistakes. And then when we got Bangladesh as an independent state, we allowed the chicken neck to continue. We could have bargained for a larger territory. So many sins were committed by people who were at the helm. So a lot of those things have started getting corrected. And this brings me to Aishwarya's book, I have tried to read the book, and I was very impressed the way it has tried to cover all aspects of Modiji's way to reform the country, to perform. And, I'm reminded of Urdu Shair Hasrat Mohani, remember, who participated in the independence movement, and then he gave the slogan of Inqilab Jindabad. He said, कुछ लोग थे कि वक्त के सांचों में ढल गए, कुछ लोग थे कि वक्त के सांचे बदल गए. All those who came, they tried to become a part of the structure that existed. Because if you want to bring change, you need a lot of guts. Modi is one leader who did not fit into Lieutenant Delhi's structure. He tried to change the structure. He tried to create his own way of thinking. Because if you want incremental change, we were a part of the movement against corruption that happened in the country. We were part of all the seminars. They used to talk about problems. We all know the problems. Do you have a solution? Very few people have found who could tell us the solution which was implementable. What you talk to the bureaucrat, they will talk about incremental changes. But incremental changes won't work for a country that has suffered for so long. You need to have a new beginning, and that has been captured in this book. You know, when I was a reporter, I used to cover the Congress also. I remember vividly one cabinet minister telling me, "Don't touch Muslims. You know, let them stay in ghettos." Why? Because reform should come from within. So I said, but you reform the Hindu law. You brought the Hindu code bill. But no, let them be what they are. This used to be the approach, but how can you ignore when your neighbor is suffering? How can you ignore when your Muslim brothers and sisters are suffering because of dilapidated laws? I'm talking of the triple talaq, which has been, covered in her book also. And I'm really impressed by the article by Kartikeya Sharma. He has captured this mood for empowerment that Modi ji has taken in terms of, say, Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao scheme, and in terms of, Lakhpati Didis, very few people may be aware, a financial inclusion revolution is happening place in rural areas through this concept of Lakhpati Didi, where, rural women becomes annual earner of 1 lakh rupees. She is termed as Lakhpati Didi, and the government helps through self-help groups and all that. We have close to 1 crore Lakhpati Didis already, and the target is 3 crore Lakhpati Didi. Imagine the kind of transformation that will happen. We already know the way reservation has been given, it would be implemented. We already know that a lot of empowerment, a lot of schemes of the government, the financial, the money goes into the account of women, not men. And this was Modi, which he learned during his chief ministership of Gujarat. Yeah, you can, if you give me time, then I'll elaborate on talking about the book, but I'm sure that you have some other questions also. Thank you.
I'll keep the topic on Pahalgam for a while, and then I'll go to larger, achievements of Modi government and what he did. We see, Aishwarya ji, this Pakistan policy. I've seen the last 10 years Modi government, the way it has dealt with Pakistan. It has been starkly different from the approach of the previous all government, including Atal Bihari Vajpayee's government. And in previous governments, they would try to reach out to Pakistan. They were more generous towards even generals there. This government says you show your intent, and then we will reach out to you. How you see this policy? Is this policy working out in the larger scheme of things?
See, there are two, three things one needs to understand. I think for the last couple of years, whatever governments we've had have not had the kind of mandate that Prime Minister Narendra Modi had in the last 10 years and continues to enjoy that level of popularity and that position. And I find it fascinating as to how there is a consistency to it. In terms of foreign policy or politics, there's a period before Modi, and then there is one period after Modi, and that period after Modi has changed the nature of politics. So automatically it is going to change the nature of foreign policy also. Because you cannot expect the foreign policy to remain a constant. Indian foreign policy has undergone 360-degree transformation, and there is a step-by-step approach. It's not like he's managed to achieve it in a day. He's first built a very, very significant relationship with leaders of different countries. That was missing. Either earlier we were aligning with Soviet Russia. We had a bad relationship with the Americans. At other times we've had relationships with China, but not with others. So we've had a rocky relationship with Bangladesh also, with Pakistan also, in that sense. So Prime Minister Narendra Modi's attitude is Pakistan is one of the many countries with whom he has a foreign policy to deal with. And that foreign policy is by nature of Indian interests. Earlier, Indian interests were not seen in terms of as it was seen as neighbors, this whole idea, we are neighbors, we are born out of the same country. And
sentiments.
And this and that. Please, if you are going to not do that, you'll have people on the streets. So you have to understand We have to keep, we have our own issues also with respect to prices and this and that and employment and other things. So please don't expect that foreign policy is going to remain the same under Narendra Modi. Why should he follow the policy of his predecessors? What is there a guideline or a rule book that he should follow the policy of his predecessors? Every prime minister has defined policy in a different way. Why don't we call Indira Gandhi a warmonger? We don't call her a warmonger. We actually say, a lot of people say she is aided in the birth of Bangladesh. But when you come to assess Narendra Modi, he should follow the policy of his predecessors. The situation is not the same like the predecessors. And whether it is Pulwama or Pahalgam or the Mumbai terror attacks, please go speak to the victims of the Mumbai terror attacks. They are as cut up as they are what they were then. So I think we need to contextualize that terror is a real issue as far as, and it is happening all over the world. In different parts of the country, countries are finally waking up to the fact that immigration has not led to cohesion. It has not led to integration. How are we going to not be realistic about it? So people worry about it. They ask government answers, and then you want the prime minister to answer it while having the policy of his predecessors. It's asking a bit too much. So I think you need to see that Narendra Modi will follow the foreign policy based on the context of what India-Pakistan relations are today. That's what I'm saying.
And thank God for that, because foreign policy can't be run on emotional values or sentimentalism. National interest is what matters, and what he had done. And you rightly give the example of.
And he's unapologetic about it. He said it in everything. That's his national policy. National interest is my national policy.
And we have seen what he did in Ukraine. It was a crisis moment for us, and we turned it to our advantage. So yeah, thank God for that. But coming to Sudeshji, I always had this one issue with Indian foreign policy, especially, was that that we used to put a lot of focus on ideology. A lot of focus on sentiments. Oh, ये हमारे से ही लोग हैं. People will go to Karachi and have some, have kachoris there and say, oh, ये तो हमारे ही जैसे लोग हैं. But वो क्या हमारे से लोग हैं? And I think we need to. The question is called Shatrubodh. There's a word called Shatrubodh in Hindi, which people often, we tend to forget in Bharat. Can you tell us more about that? Because if you have to deal with Pakistan, we have to sort out some of these problems. Some of these words like Shatrubodh or क्या ये हमारे से लोग हैं. हम कैसे इसको deal करें?
As Tony Abbott has said in one of your articles, they want India to take lead. What should be the ideology of India? They say that it should be democracy, because India has had long relation with communist regime. Say, for example, USSR, earlier USSR, now Russia, who has proven to be good friends. But those who preach us about democracy, they are the ones who hobnobbed with Taliban. They are the ones who hobnobbed with terrorism. Now Pakistan has clearly accepted that, yes, they were the ones who, helped the US track terrorism. They took money for that. So it's no longer a secret that Pakistan is using terror as a method of its foreign policy to settle its past score with India. What is the score with India? It's neighbors' jealousy. Pakistan has stayed a dilapidated, dejected, a medieval kind of society where now there is hunger, there is all kinds of problems, but India has marched ahead. And this not bracketing India with Pakistan has happened after Modi ji has come to power. It was every leader who used to come to India, they would invariably religiously go to Pakistan. We used to be clubbed, but this clubbing has not happened after Modi ji has come, because you can't do that. If you are coming to India, come and do with us. And ideologically we have gained. So on that count also, on the count of democracy, we should, go and have what we want to implement in Pakistan. Because unless there is democracy, genuine democracy, not governed by Islamists, but really governed by people who may have Islam as a religion, but their ethos is secular. And herein, I really found this book very useful. M.D. Nalapat has written a great concept of Bharat versus India. When we come to Bharat versus India, earlier the British looked at us as India, not Bharat. Had they looked at us as Bharat, they would not have given Pakistan on religious lines, because Bharat never accepted this religious divide. It was always a secular country. All the secular countries, the kings used to fight for territory. They never fought for religion, unless we include the Islamists who came and captured and started fostering the religion rather, and then the Christians who came. But India never did that. So the Bharat concept has got a plus point, rejuvenation, which I call a Renaissance time has come, where things like Bharat, the cultural awakening, we call Ram Temple is a cultural awakening. It's not just about getting a temple constructed there. It's placing the epitome of culture, the epitome of truth, the epitome of how a person behaves, how a king behaves. The entire seminal ideas of constitution, of judiciary has emerged from the concept of Ram Rajya. And this has been chronicled by our constitution makers. So we are talking in that context. You see, Modiji's other steps also, like popularizing yoga at the world stage as wholesome health. You know, there is an article, I am forgetting who has written it, about health. You know, that India is doing very well in health infrastructure and trying to keep comprehensive, bringing out other medicinal things also. And yoga is prominent in that. The world has accepted that. So when we used to talk about, you know, Hindu brain, we are not trying to impose a culture on others. We are talking about that stage where we were civilizationally far ahead, and we treated people as Vasudeva Kutumbakam. There is another article on Vasudeva Kutumbakam. When we talk of world as a family, have you ever taken someone as Christians or Muslims? Never. But you talk of, these religious practices. They don't take others as brothers. You have to be a Christian. You either get converted or just get demolished. So is the problem with Islamists. So if you have Vasudeva Kutumbakam, you may have the right to practice your religion and propagate it also, but you will not force it. You will not force people either through sword or through allurement. So this civilization march is happening very strongly under Modi ji, because we should behave as citizens of this country, irrespective of our personal faith, Hindu, Muslim, Christians, or whatever. And if that happens, then the country is truly marching towards the Renaissance period, which we all visualize. And you have talked about eminent historians. Historians, they have distorted history. They have taught us that this used to be like this. Even now, Bipin Chandra, who is one of the most eminent historians, his book is prescribed for UPSC students. They become IAS. What are they reading? They're reading nothing about INA. They're reading only about Mughals and their glory. But those who fought against them, they've been completely ignored. You could probably throw light on that.
Yeah, that's another long debate. But I'll just bring it back to the topics we're talking about. Very early in the book, you know, there's a chapter on the Arab diplomacy, and I believe that has been one of the success stories of the Modi government. And you look what after Pahalgaon, not a single Arab country has come against India, which is kind of it's unprecedented in many ways, except Turkey. And that also is kind of very apologetically saying few things, not saying few other things. How do you see the Bharat's, under Modi government's Arab policy, how it evolved? And
See, my chapter in the book starts with the thing, it defines legacy. It tells you what does legacy actually mean, something that you pass on to your children or something like that. I think the Prime Minister has negated the legacy of previous relationships that we had with other countries. The relationship with the Arab world was a big problem because we didn't have a relationship. So majority of the different countries, we were busy trying to kind of juxtapose where do we stand with vis-a-vis Palestine, Israel, sounding politically correct and that. I don't know, I as a historian, I'm still not able to find why did we need to define our position vis-a-vis Israel and Palestine? What's the compulsion about Israel and Palestine? The second thing is, we have he has an individualistic relationship with Qatar, with Saudi Arabia, with UAE. And mind you, what we call the Middle East is not a homogeneous territory. Very divided, with completely different interests, as you may know. To have navigate each of those relationships individually and have that sort of thing. I think I still remember for the longest time it was felt that if we abolish triple talaq or if we have the integration of J&K, that would be this reaction, that reaction, and the Muslim world would be against us. No sort of a reaction came because triple talaq has been abolished in a lot of countries of the Islamic world. So there is a certain history to it because triple talaq was abolished because it was not being practiced in the way it is supposed to be practiced, and also it was done for a cause of the fact that destitute women who happened to be Muslims were being divorced and left and stuff like that. So what you need to understand is that whatever storm we have weathered, even including Pahalgam, the relationship now which we have with different countries of the Arab world, which constitutes the Middle East, there has been no sort of a reaction. Actually, no. Why would any other country give an adverse reaction? Would they say, no, we support terrorism? We support the killing of citizens? So I don't think so. Any sane government would support that. And whether you have all these countries, they also have their individual interests. And they are not looking at it vis-a-vis a Hindu-Muslim problem. For God's sake, everyone needs to stop seeing it as a Hindu-Muslim problem. It has to be seen as a wider terror problem, which is an all-world phenomena. It's a global phenomena. Terror could strike anywhere. So I think the countries of the Middle East are also viewing terror as a problem for them also. Extremism is now becoming a problem for them like it is a problem for Europe now. Saudi Arabia is investing to rebuild Syria. Why? Because a disturbed Syria means a disturbed Middle East. So that is what one needs to realize.
You see, two issues basically. Modi ji's philosophy has been that you engage people economically. I remember meeting him. There was a loss-making organization, GSPS. It's a Gujarat State Petroleum Corporation. And it was on sale. So he stopped that. I said, why did you do that? Because we were talking about disinvestment. He said, देखो मैं गुजराती हूँ, मुझे पता है क्या करना है. इसको जब तक मैं प्रॉफिट मेकिंग नहीं करूँगा, तब तक ये बिकेगा नहीं. और स्टेट का जो पैसा लगा है वो लॉस पे जाएगा. So he always has an economic thinking, and which has helped. You see, economic thinking which was empowerment. If at all India has to reach its glory, economically we need to be powerful. Now we are the fifth largest. Very soon we will be the fourth, overtaking Japan, and then Germany by 2027 will be the third largest. I don't know, it's difficult to take over China or US because they are very large economies. But Arab countries, they are looking for some other avenues for investment. They know that oil is not going to take care of them for a long time. They have gone in a big way into real estate. They have come to India in a big way, investing even in Kashmir. And the more you engage them economically, you are sure that they are going to see reason. I'm not saying that they will support whatever you say, but we have been able to separate Pakistan's terror support from religion. Pakistan wants to become, Ummah kind of thing, which is there, the concept in Islam, that what Pakistan says is ultimate of Islam, but they don't even recognize Indian Muslims or Pakistani Muslims as real Muslims. So Arab world also has a problem with Pakistan, and we have said that it's not against Islam. You see the way Saudi Arabia, the way Dubai, they have allowed Hindu temples to be built, and the way the kind of respect they have given, because they don't want fanaticism to come. They know that finally society has to survive, and they're very proud of their Islamic belief system, but they don't see terrorism as a tool to settle scores. So this we have been able to drive ideologically to everywhere, every country in the world, and Islamic countries more particularly, because we said that we are the second largest Muslim population in the world. So if at all, for membership in the OIC, India's claim is much more. After Indonesia, it's not Pakistan. So why do you listen to Pakistan? Listen to us. We will speak on behalf of Indian Muslims. And for Indian Muslims, they also need to understand that enough of, pro-Pakistan, which happens, I'm not saying entire, but sometimes it happens, they firecrackers when Indian team loses and all such things, this creates animosities. But finally, by and large, Indian Muslims also have their own ethos, own civilizational ethos, which are essentially Hindus.
I agree. In fact, Modi government has invested quite a bit on our world and West Asia, and it is paying dividends now. It has started paying. Another area where Modi government has paid quite money, invested quite a lot, is in America, and especially Donald Trump. And we are living in a Trumpian era, as we can say that. And if you see the reactions of the American administration after Pahalgam, it has been quite remarkably distinct from what it used to be in the past. In the past, the first thing they will say, "Oh, please don't do anything." Now they are saying that we are with you in this fight against terror. How do you see this American approach of dealing with Trumpian America?
See, again, that I will take you back, being a historian, I'll take you back to the history of Indian-US relationship. Earlier, after our country became independent and after for the first 3-4 decades after independence, we were very peripheral to American imagination and American interests or American calculations also. Whether it was Richard Nixon or Ronald Reagan or even Bush to a certain degree, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, we really didn't figure in the calculations of American diplomacy, American economic interests. For the first time, we feature in American calculations politically, strategically, and economically. So that's one plus that one has to see, and that has, again, that goes back to the personal relationship between Narendra Modi and Trump. If you'll ask me, what about Japan? It goes back to the personal relationship between the late Shinzo Abe and Narendra Modi. So I cannot rule out, in such personality-driven times, I cannot rule out the relationship that leaders have that has a role to play in the policy. American interests are also undergoing a 360-degree transformation. They have tariffs, they have other things coming up. Their country is also going into a very, very different metamorphosis at this point of time. But earlier, if you ask me about 3-4 decades ago, America didn't really care where India stood. It was at best a big, large country in South Asia, and okay, you had different prime ministers visiting, but what sort of a relationship we had? We did not have any kind of a relationship. I would say now it is more of a special relationship that exists. And also that American foreign policy has undergone transformation. You've seen Trump's withdrawal from Afghanistan. You have seen that whether it was Osama bin Laden, he was found in Pakistan. America has become alive to the fact that they also have a real danger of terrorism. And like I said, terrorism is a global phenomena now. You could just be heading out to the market and you would incur a loss of family member if there is a blast or something. So I think America is also looking at it, and it is looking at India as a major partner, as a South Asia partner, major partner in terms of a democracy. It's a robust democracy. We've had elections after elections. If you see, its prime ministers, every time he has a mandate with destiny, he somehow seems to be coming on top, because it has to do with what has been the nature of and what people expect of Narendra Modi. So it's been very different in comparison to other prime ministers. If you compare it with Indira Gandhi, it was a completely different expectation. If you compare it with Nehru, it was a completely different expectation. Nehru was a prime minister of one of the first few years of independence. Indira Gandhi inherited his legacy. She was a part of the Congress system. Narendra Modi is none of it. He has nothing to do with the Congress system. So he's the first outsider to the entire thing. Vajpayee was also in a part of the Congress system. He had the Congress system was a system where Congress was a given as far as things. Narendra Modi is not grown up in that climate. How can you expect him to have the same approach?
Yeah, very good point. Because, I remember in my book, last book in Bharat Rising, I had used the term after 2014 Republic 2.0, because this Modi government's approach is absolutely different, starkly different from what used to be the approach of previous governments. But I'll continue with your book, Shwaraji. In fact, I found it quite prophetic, when you write in intro about the neighborhood. You say, and I quote you, while there have been some remarkable successes, especially in how India is perceived abroad and its reception among the Indian diaspora, the challenges of unstable and aggressive neighbors remain. Now we look at Pakistan, we look at Bangladesh, especially the two, there are many others, and we say, oh, you are absolutely spot on. Now I'll bring you here to Bangladesh, because that has been really no pen in our whatever. And how should we deal with this Bangladeshi challenge which you're facing now currently? And another question which often people ask: did we make a mistake of putting all our eggs in Sheikh Hasina's basket?
I wouldn't say that because Sheikh Hasina has a certain kind of legacy and credibility which came with a certain kind of trajectory that Bangladesh took since its creation in 1971. We saw massive murders, rapes, kidnappings, which were a precursor to the making of Bangladesh. We've more or less had a very good relationship with Bangladesh because there is a shared history, a shared linguistic identity, which is in Bengali, and shared civilizational habits and cultures in that sense. And a substantial population which moves. You have to see the Indo-Bangladesh border. People are moving cross-border. A lot of historians have written about it. You just go to buy fish in the evening and you cook it for supper. So it is that sort of a thing. So I think the India-Bangladesh relationship has also undergone an evolution, because Bangladesh is we have a lot of economic interest, a lot of production happening in Bangladesh, and we have also had a certain kind of history. It's very difficult to ignore that country, and we do have families who have their families there. It is very difficult to, if there is a concern of an American citizen whose family is staying in India, of course the Americans are going to address it. Similarly, if there is a concern of Indian citizen whose families reside in Bangladesh, how do you expect? I don't know why people find it very unusual that India is reacting to Bangladesh with asking them to protect minorities and other things. Yes, Hindus are a minority there. Americans would also react the same way to American citizens in any location, if Afghanistan, Iraq or anything, try to evacuate them, get them to safety and other things. So I think one thing we really need to see is that what trajectory does Bangladesh take now? Unsettled Bangladesh is a problem for us because we can't have two hostile neighbors, or probably three, one China in that sense. And it'll become very, very problematic in that sense. And I think the Prime Minister is trying to navigate that relationship. Sheikh Hasina is still one of the credible leaders. She has won many elections. She has been in leadership roles. It's not. How can you predict what will happen a couple of years down the line? So to say that we have no relationship with anyone emanating from Bangladesh would be very difficult. If the current leadership in Bangladesh chooses to pick another country over us, then we'll also have to look after our own interest. And there are people. How do we know that the current leadership in Bangladesh enjoys the full faith of the people? Why not understand that Sheikh Hasina still has a certain history that comes with it, and her interests are that way. So we need to again start thinking only of Indian interests, and that's how Narendra Modi's foreign policy is India first. Forget about anything. And what I've understood of the leader, he's not going to be apologetic about it. He gets the mandate from the people in the elections that happen every 5 years, and probably every time we have a state election, he gets the mandate. So he draws his strength from the mandate. It doesn't matter what his detractors might think. And I don't think so in what I've understood of the Prime Minister. He's just going on and on with his plans. He seems to be unbothered by all of that.
Sudeshji, I'll come back to you. And on this Bangladesh issue itself, the problem called Muhammad Yunus and the kind of statements he's making, is actually openly moving China, trying to challenge India in that way. So how should we deal with him, But there are people, in very credible people now coming up with suggestion that it's time that we should strengthen our chicken neck. What's your opinion?
You see, Utpal, Bangladesh actually is a classic example where radicalization has taken the country away from its secular credentials. When Bangladesh became an independent country, thanks to India, it rejected that religious thing. It was basically a linguistic kind of country. And they were very happy about that. But radicalization and influence of Pakistan there, it has actually increased. And even Yunus, for that matter, is going to face the heat. I have seen the stories that they've asked Yunus to behave, otherwise he will go the Sina way. Okay, this is what they have said. So Bangladesh itself is going to explode, and India has to be very careful along the borders, because we already have so many Bangladeshi here. The government is trying to find solution to that, but you know that Aadhaar card can be manipulated. It is very difficult to stop corruption. Saying is much easier. So unless that happens, it is a very tough task. We have nabbed Bangladeshis in Gujarat, even in Delhi. Sending them back is also a difficult task, because whether the government accepts it or not, because it's a different government altogether. They may just refuse it, the way Pakistan refused its citizen who were, stayed in India. So it's a difficult situation. Yes, we would not like to have a hostile relation with Bangladesh, because we have always respected that country. We have worked for that country, and India had a great role. And that sentiment needs to be restored there. That is only possible through de-radicalization.
I have one point to make. A historical anecdote that Muhammad Yunus must remember. When you're in a leadership position, you tend to forget. Bangladesh, in that country, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, the founding father of Bangladesh, was assassinated. So you never know when it might come back in that sense, when radicalization reaches a level. It's that same country where he was considered God, that his entire family was assassinated and slaughtered. Yes. So you understand, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was a demigod sort of a status. And from that to be having his entire family assassinated, including him. So you never know what happens with leadership. You never take any leadership as a given. That's a history lesson that one should have.
Now I'll come to basically the topic of a book, Indian Renaissance. You call Modi decade Indian Renaissance. It's a very strong support vote that way to the achievement of work of the Modi government. What makes you say that?
The reason why I've called it the Modi decade is because it is the Modi decade. And
Indian Renaissance, I'm saying Indian
Indian
Renaissance.
Renaissance, okay.
Indian Renaissance is a very strong word.
Because nothing, what is Renaissance? Renaissance is rebirth, revival, whatever you might put it as that. Civilizationally, it is a completely different time that we are living in, with a push towards civilizational celebration of our civilizational history, which is very, very significant. It is also looking at foreign policy or looking at domestic policy in a very different light. He's also overseen, along with other leaders in the party, the reach of the Bharatiya Janata Party to a different level. They had 2 seats in 1951, so it's a long journey. So you have to see that it is almost, it is Indian Renaissance, the Modi decade is because it is a different sort of India, and it's never going to be the same with our consumption of social media, with our the kind of narrative of elections. It's the control of the narrative that I find very, very fascinating about Narendra Modi or the Bharatiya Janata Party. It remains a dominant force in that sense of the term. It is something akin to what Congress had in the 1950s and 60s. It was a dominant force even ideologically. You thought like that. So now you think, a large part does think in a certain way. So in that sense, it's a different sort of a revival, rebirth, or a different sort of an India. And that is why I called it Indian Renaissance. It's not going to be the same India again, in any sense of the term, economically, politically, strategically, or in any sense of the term.
Culturally too.
Yeah, it's not going to be the same India. And that's what we have to realize. And that is why it is defined and shaped and completely transformed by him. So his imprint is so deep, it will be very difficult to kind of evaluate it away from, if you move away from Narendra Modi as a figure. So that's all.
One of your articles has quoted, and I would quote this because this sums up what you're asking when we are talking about Indian Renaissance. Actually, whether looking at us as Indian or Bharat, Bharat trusts you. Bharat says that you don't need attestation of gazetted officer, dismantling legacy, what she has written about. Earlier, I remember, because I belong to that era, I had to take a signature of gazetted officer on my certificates issued by a competent authority, and unless the gazetted officer attested, that was not considered to be final. But Modi ji came and said, no, why? You can self-attest, and self-attestation is, though Bharat trusts you. Bharat trusts you and gives you loan, mudra loan, and they know that you will, the culture is such that you would not die with a rain on you, with a debt on you. You will give back the debt. This is Bharat. But India doesn't trust you. And this is what Amartya Sen says, and one of your articles has quoted it. The natives, viewing of themselves and their cultures through the colonizer's prism of prejudice, is one of the most dehumanizing legacies of the colonial period. And Modi ji has helped us to come out of that. 2,000 dilapidated laws have been scrapped. Now you can have your license online. Most of the things, unless you want to bribe, you don't need to bribe the system comes to you. And we feel proud of being a member of the culture that is ingrained in Bharat. I don't identify with India, because India means Lutyens' Delhi, you know, all chicaneries and manipulations and what happened during British continued. So it's time to dismantle the legacy. And that is what Modi ji has been doing. And of course, Renaissance means that we must be rich culturally, literally, and we must have great occasions like this. And the government has done. There's a lot of things happening in Jammu and Kashmir. What you see today, a lot of literary activities took place in other places also, celebrating Bharat. That is what I would say, that a good period, and of course is going to continue. Thank you.
In fact, one of the reasons why I prefer the term Bharat rather than India is that, you know, it connects me with my civilizational roots. That we are not a country which was made in 1947, but we are made some 10,000 years back, at least. But yeah, taking this argument forward. In fact, Aishwarya ji, while reading a book, in fact, I came across another interesting line, and I thought I'll quote you here. It is under Modi that party, which is BJP, has been centered on the personality of one person as a principal vote getter. Yet, under him, we have seen the rise of strong regional leadership within the BJP. Now, we have seen, I agree, this is the truth here. But there is also some kind of, you know, people say that there is contradiction. You know, it's all about Modi. They say that, you know, today's BJP is just like, you know, Indira Gandhi's Congress of 1970s, where it's all about Indira. Indira is India. So what do you say about that? How is it different?
Dr. Pandit, in respect of time, can we request you to make that the last answer, please? We have the next session. Thank you so much.
I don't think so. I don't think so. It's the same India of India is Indira and Indira is India. We have seen very powerful chief ministers in different states across India. You have you had Shivraj Singh Chauhan till 2023. You have Yogi Adityanath. You have a Devendra Fadnavis. They are not the chief ministers of the Indira era. They're not like the chief ministers. They are very powerful regional leaders in that sense. And Modi seems to be very comfortable in his skin, but and there has been a general assessment that it has transformed the BJP in many ways. You see very many powerful leaders coexisting with the Prime Minister. at this point of time, and each having their own constituency and an area that they command and other things in that sense of the term. For example, you have a very, very popular foreign minister who I don't think so that would have been the case earlier. So there was no one popular than Indira Gandhi at that point of time. So it's a very different thing, but ultimately it boils down to the fact that the Prime Minister is a very, very towering figure in that thing, and his imprint, like I said, is very deep. But it is not like the government of Indira Gandhi, where you cherry-picked chief ministers, or you didn't have, within your cabinet, you could not have the recognizable faces. You had a Morarji Desai at some point and other things, but here you have a lot of very, very important leaders. You have the Home Minister, who seems to have a very, very powerful position within the party and the government as well, and has his own constituency. Dr. Jaishankar,
Gadkari is there.
Gadkari ji is there. Dr. Jaishankar is very, very popular. He's the rock star foreign minister. So please understand that it is not Indira's India, and I don't think so Prime Minister is looking at that. Whatever people might say, he's following a very different trajectory. A very different BJP is emerging.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Please accept my apology for interrupting, but thank you for that insightful session.